Hi Year 12. I thought I'd make a video because the Viva Voce can be quite intimidating. People think that it's really hard, but we actually make the Viva Voce to make it a lot easier for you and for you to be able to ask questions at the end so you can actually enhance your marks. So I'm going to go through each question and how I think it should be answered so you can watch this at home or when you're not sure. So the first one, discuss your understanding of discovery. If I was going to approach this question, I would do it as in my understanding of discovery is threefold. So the first one would be referring to the rubric. The second would be how discovery is represented in my texts. And the third one would be how I perceive discovery via my personal perspective. Because as we know, when you create a thesis in English, we really need to hear your personal perspective and your thesis coming through. So if we're looking at the rubric, and if you don't have a copy, make sure you tell your teacher so we can get you one. It's talking about the type of discovery. So are you discovering something for the first time? Are you rediscovering something that is lost, forgotten, or concealed? Is it sudden or unexpected? Does it emerge from a process of deliberate and careful planning, or is the discovery thrust upon the person? Is it evoked by curiosity, necessity, or wonder? Is it fresh and meaningful? It can also be emotional, creative, intellectual, and physical and spiritual. Most discoveries can be confronting or provocative, and most importantly, they lead us to new worlds, to stimulate new ideas, or to obtain new values, or to speculate upon the future. And it offers new understandings of ourselves and others. So that's where the main transformation comes from. And the transformation can just be within yourself, or the transformation can be far-reaching across the world, which we'll talk about a little bit in a minute. Then you need to talk about, and it's only 1 minute, so you will need to plan it carefully, but then talk about other ways that you have developed your understanding of discovery. So for example, through the texts. So if you look at Robert Gray, for example, much of his are personal discoveries. They're very intimate discoveries of the persona in his life, especially when we're looking at diptych or the meatworks. And the result being one of acknowledgement of your situation or acceptance. Or there's kind of forgiveness with diptych, or the possibility of acknowledging for future change and speculating about the future. Then you need to think about where in your related material you have gotten your understanding from discovery as well. And then on a personal level, because we like to know what you think as well, and if I was going to do this assessment task, I would say something like the self is most important, self-discovery, as this allows you to change yourself, which then can have an impact on others and therefore the greater world, and therefore your discovery becomes more far-reaching. So think about those three things for the first question. The second question is, how are the core texts, yours is Robert Gray for standard and Tempest for an advanced, an appropriate choice for the area of study? So go back to the rubric, because when I mark this, I like to hear keywords from the rubric. I think that shows that you've engaged with the rubric and you know what is expected from you. So use it as a kind of a checklist, but make sure that you are looking at Gray's poems holistically. So you're not just talking about meatworks and you're not just talking about diptych. So have a think about how his poems, the discovery can range from planned or unplanned, how they're all very intimate and personal encounters of discovery, and how they're transformative. And even though he doesn't change the world, he does come to some change of the way he feels about other people, or is able to forgive other people, or there's an acknowledgement that something's not quite right in his life, or something is not quite right in the environment. So think about the core text. Much the same way as question 2, question 3 asks, how is your related material an appropriate choice for the area of study? Now you'll do something very similar in terms of looking at the rubric, looking at it as a kind of a checklist of how your related material fits into the rubric. Then here's your chance to compare and contrast your related material to Robert Gray's poems. So is your related material, do they range, is there planned and unplanned discoveries in there? Are they intimate and personal, or are they more broad? Are they more about the environment? So compare and contrast them. And then the transformations, maybe the transformations are inner, or maybe they are far-reaching, maybe they are more obvious than in the Gray's poem. So compare and contrast what is the same and what is not. And always look at the type of discovery, the impact it has on the individual, so psychological, emotional, spiritual, Is it challenging? Is it provocative? Is it confronting? And then look at the transformation. So if you look at it in those 3 ways and use the rubric as a checklist, you're answering the questions exactly how we would like you to. Question 4. Analyze one stanza or scene or excerpt from one core text and discuss how techniques are used to shape how discovery is conveyed. This is when you need to get your annotations from your poems. I don't mind if you choose 1 poem or if you choose 2 or 3 poems, that's okay, but don't forget you've only got a minute to answer this question. So then go in depth. Don't just tell me about one technique within the poem. Read me a quote or a part of the poem, a couple of lines, and then show me that you understand the techniques used and why they're used. And in this section, I'll be looking for about 3 to 5 techniques. 3 would be really good if you could talk about them in a detailed way. And that's what I'm after, okay? You're not going to get out of that C range if you can't talk about at least 3 techniques from an excerpt, because I know if I look at many of your annotations, they are full with techniques. So take them out and pull them apart and look at which techniques best show or give examples of the discoveries that you're talking about in the text. Now, for question 5, analyze one section of your related material and discuss how techniques are used to explore how discovery is conveyed. For example, if I was doing this task, I might use the picture of Dorian Gray, which is a classic novel written by Oscar Wilde. And so as an example, I would say, in this text, I would like to talk about symbolism. The quote that talks about symbolism is, "Behind every exquisite thing that existed, there was something tragic." Now, in this particular novel, the portrait is the symbol. It is the portrait of how Dorian Gray has chosen to sell his soul to remain eternally youthful and beautiful and charismatic and wonderful, but the portrait is a symbol of the way that his soul has deteriorated and the cost of this outer beauty and outer youth, eternal youth. So the portrait is very much a symbol here because the symbol is really ugly and deteriorating and shows what his soul looks like. Then I might talk about narrator point of view. So my quote is, "I'm tired of myself tonight. I should like to be somebody else." Most of the novel takes place from Dorian Gray's perspective, so we really understand where he's coming from, why he made his choices, and even today, probably most of us might choose the eternal fountain of youth if we just have an ugly portrait hanging up in the attic. But obviously, if you've read it, we know that's not the only consequence for him. But not only is that the narrator point of view from Dorian's perspective, so we understand why he makes the poor choices that he does, it also provides us with empathy, because the way he says, "I'm tired of myself tonight, I should like to be somebody else," we've all been there, right? We've all woken up, we've all been tired of ourselves or made a mistake or wished we could go back and change something, and you just need a break from your own brain. And so we can understand that. And so through the narration, the narrative point of view and the personal perspective of Dorian Gray, we are provided with empathy. And so there are 2 techniques, empathy and narrator point of view. And then I've also talked about symbolism in the first one. So then that would probably be a minute and that would be good enough. If you wanted to keep going, you could then talk about another technique, and you could say there's also a tone of moral ambiguity within the text, because at some points the Dorian Gray is talked about very admiringly, but in other times there's some judgment, and so there's a juxtaposition between those 2 things. So what I'm trying to show you here is that when you have a quote or an idea, try and pull more than one technique out of it, because as you're speaking, I'm going to be writing down what you say. And so if I was marking what I just said, I would have written down symbolism, I would have written down narrator point of view, empathy, tone, and juxtaposition. And I've talked about the five techniques, and I've provided quotes, and I've talked about how they create meaning. And so then I would extend that and say, and through these techniques, we can see the discovery that is starting to come through for the reader and for Dorian Gray. So with the symbolism of the portrait, the reader understands that there are going to be serious consequences and because of what he's chosen to do. And so the discovery that just because you think something might be a good idea at the time, you really need to weigh up those pros and cons. In terms of empathy, we see that Dorian here is starting to get some self-discovery and some reflection, and he's tired of himself and he wants to be somebody else. So he's starting to go on that journey of discovery that maybe this hasn't been a great idea. It's actually really tiring doing this because I'm worried about having this dual life. And then I've got this portrait that's like a representation of my soul, and perhaps this wasn't a great idea anyway. So then you go back to your rubric and you look at how these techniques show self-discovery or discovery that is far-reaching, because even though other characters are impacted negatively by Dorian, it makes us think, especially in our world of social media and trying to put filters on everything, it makes us think, what would we do for eternal youth? What ramifications would we be willing to accept for that? The last part is the questions that I'm going to ask you. Now, don't freak out about this, because this is not to trick you, okay? These questions are not to make it uncomfortable for you. These questions are to actually get you more marks. So you could be sitting on about a C because you've talked a little bit about discovery, you've mentioned a couple of terms from the rubric, but you haven't really expanded on enough techniques or expanded on them in detail. So I'm going to ask you a question so you can try and get a greater mark, okay? I'm not asking you a question to trick you up. I'm not asking you a question to make it harder. I'm asking you a question to try and boost your C to a high C or maybe even a B. So I might say to you, can you expand upon your techniques that you used, or can you think of another one, or can you think of more terms from the rubric, or you didn't really talk about your related text as much as you talked about grey, so can you sort of fill that gap a little bit? And then I'll be able to tick that you've actually done that from the criteria and hopefully give you a better mark. So I hope this little clip has given you a better indication of what's expected from the Viva Voce. It's actually one of the assessment tasks that people, once they've done it, they say they have enjoyed, because they get to sit and talk. It's not in front of their class, it's just in front of me. We just sit down at a table and you have the opportunity to improve your marks, which you never really get again. You don't get to sit in the exam and write an essay and then go back and fix it for the same mark. Okay, so good luck. Email your teachers, not the night before, but email them if you need some help. Show us some drafts and come prepared and be confident, and I'll see you then.